I'm joined now by Mr. Tom Watson, former deputy leader of the Labour Party and one of the most vocal figures for reform within the industry. Mr. Watson, welcome to ICE 2020. How willing is the industry to engage with regulators?
Well, in the UK, I think first of all there is admittance that the relationship between regulators, Parliament and industry leaders hit a low point over fixed odds betting terminals and the whole saga of stake reduction. And I think actually where I've been very pleasantly surprised is that everyone recognises, we don't want that to typify how we do public policy, how we do legislation and regulation. So I think industry leaders are now coalescing around what could be a common front on reform, which may be enough to satisfy Parliament and importantly the stakeholder groups that have been calling for gambling reform for some years.
And speaking of reform, how outdated is the 2005 Gambling Act?
I've described it as a kind of an analogue act in the digital age, and you go back to that. It's a very fiendishly complex piece of legislation. I actually sat on the passage of the bill as a junior government whip most of the day, terrified that we'd lose a vote, but it does mention postal betting more times than online betting, so there's a sort of sense that perhaps the parameters of that act are not fit for purpose. Though, of course, there is industry pushback where they say, well, hold on a minute, you laid a lot of contingency planning in legislation where there are powers for ministers to beef up the regulatory framework. There are things it misses, though. And there's a critical piece of work on loot boxes, I think, which sort of looks at the the world between video gaming and online betting that the legislative framework does not yet cover.
And how sophisticated is some of the targeting for the vulnerable? You did allude to it in there.
Yeah, I think, look, there's a revolution in data science, and I'm not saying this is unique to the sector. You've only got to look at politics to realise how there is very great concern about the use of data science to target vulnerable voters or to in some way mislead voters with fake news and fake propaganda. But the worst excesses of the industry, much of it unlicensed, not on UK borders, but it still gets into our jurisdiction, are groups of people who are targeting vulnerable gamblers. And for me, how we stop that is a really important challenge. And by the way, there are industry leaders who understand that this is a real challenge, that whilst their own companies are not involved in that kind of practice, they know that as a sector they've got to find a way of stopping it.
And can you give me an idea of the scale of the problem? How many problem gamblers are there out there?
Well, I just go off the figures from the Gambling Commission. But if you start with a ballpark figure that there are broadly a third of a million vulnerable gamblers out there in various degrees of vulnerability, then I think that's a good starting point. And how you frame an array of services that mean they can be lifted out of going down a journey where they lose everything, I think is a really important challenge.
And can you outline very briefly what's on your agenda for positive reform and therefore on the industry's agenda?
Well, look, for me, I'm now an ex-politician, although obviously I see this as unfinished business. We started as a party started looking at this more than half a decade ago. I think, firstly, how do you set up a framework where there's meaningful engagement based around trust between Parliament and industry? The newly beefed up BGC are clearly a role in that. If they are the trade body, umbrella body for the UK licensed sector engaging with Parliament, I think just establishing what the frameworks of reform could be, not putting numbers on it, at state reduction, how you look at advertising, what you do with data science, how you develop and support a framework of prevention. If we know that at the heart of this is preventing harm, I think you can build around, reform can be built around that and how you achieve that.
So is it a bare knuckle fight, a fight to the death?
No, I've actually, I mean, it did feel like that on FOBTs. I mean, there's sometimes it really felt like, there was belligerence on behalf of the people lobbying for the industry. I think there is a recognition on all sides of that. It was very unproductive. And for me, genuinely very pleasantly surprised that industry leaders accepted that perhaps there was a mistake on all sides with that particular piece of reform, and we don't want the next 5 years to be typified by that kind of culture.
So can reform work for the industry and the consumer?
Oh, I hope so. Yes, I think so. I mean, I spent a lot of time when I was sort of doing my homework on this. I remember talking to sort of psychiatrists who were treating gambling addiction, and just looking at how, what the array of interventions could be to make people well, and it's very doable, but it requires organisation of resource and it requires commitment. And so if you put harm prevention at the heart of this reform, this next reform era, I think we can come out of it very proud of our UK industry. It could be, great innovators in the world, hiring people on good money with well-trained jobs, and allowing people to enjoy recreational gambling that brings pleasure and joy to their lives. I mean, that's the goal. There's quite a journey to get to that, but I think it is very possible that we could get there.
So the scale of the task ahead is large, but you're confident of finding a way.
Yes, I think there's goodwill on all sides. It's not an us and them situation now. I mean, look, the industry leaders are before the House of Lords committee in the weeks ahead. There's a whole load of parliamentary reviews, but so far so good. I think people are, I think people recognise, everyone is trying to find a consensus ground here where we can be genuinely proud of the UK gambling sector and the role they do, the role they play in making our economy great, but looking after vulnerable gamblers as well.
Tom, thank you very much indeed.